The roar of B-25 Mitchell bombers cutting through the Tokyo sky on April 18, 1942, fundamentally shifted the entire course of the Pacific War. What happened that day forced Japan into a defensive crouch, a posture that would ultimately prove instrumental in sealing the nation's defeat. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant naval strategist who had orchestrated Pearl Harbor, reportedly suffered a profound shock when he learned the news. His chief of staff, Admiral Matome Ugaki, captured the moment in his diary that very day. "The victory belonged to the enemy," he wrote simply. This first assault on Japanese soil in more than 6 centuries accomplished far more psychologically than the relatively modest physical devastation suggested. 50 people dead, 252 wounded, 90 buildings reduced to rubble. These numbers seem almost minor on paper, but the psychological blow proved catastrophic. The raid shattered Japan's carefully constructed myth of homeland invulnerability, a belief the nation had clung to for generations. The shock triggered a cascade of strategic misjudgments that would haunt Japan's military planners. 7 weeks later, these errors would contribute directly to Japan's first major naval defeat at Midway. The psychological trauma ran so deep that the officer commanding Tokyo's air defenses eventually took his own life through ritual suicide, consumed by shame. As Captain Kurashima Yamamoto, the operations officer, later reflected, the raid passed like a shiver over Japan, a brief moment of terror with lasting reverberations. The force consisted of 16 specially modified B-25 Mitchell bombers, each laden with 4 500-pound bombs. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led the mission from aboard USS Hornet, launching from a position roughly 650 nautical miles from Japan. They were forced to launch 10 hours earlier than planned after the Japanese picket boat Nito Maru spotted them at 7:38 in the morning. The distance proved much farther than anybody had intended, 250 miles beyond the original plan. What followed demonstrated American ingenuity, exposed critical weaknesses in Japanese defense, and set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in Japan's catastrophic defeat at Midway. The Imperial Japanese Navy had operated under a fundamental assumption that proved spectacularly wrong. Carrier-launched bomber attacks from American aircraft were simply not possible based on their understanding of naval aviation physics. Japanese naval strategists had calculated with mathematical precision that carrier-based aircraft could operate only within a 200 to 250 nautical mile range from their home ship. After dropping their payloads, these planes needed to turn around and make it back to the carrier. Their entire defensive perimeter reflected this assumption. The entire concept of launching medium-sized bombers from a carrier deck violated everything Japanese doctrine understood about naval warfare. The core problem seemed rooted in basic physics and engineering constraints. The B-25 Mitchell possessed a 67-foot wingspan that absolutely dwarfed standard carrier aircraft. Compare it to the F-4F Wildcat at 27 feet or the SBD Dauntless at 42 feet, and the difference becomes staggering. A loaded B-25 tipped the scales at roughly 27,000 to 29,000 pounds, nearly 3 times heavier than the typical carrier aircraft. Japanese calculations showed that normal takeoff requirements exceeded 800 feet of runway distance. No aircraft carrier on Earth possessed a deck anywhere near that length. The mathematics seemed ironclad. Such a thing simply could not happen. Yet it did happen, and it happened through meticulous American engineering. At Eglinton Field in Florida, American technicians had spent weeks transforming these bombers into something the Japanese deemed impossible. They installed 265-gallon steel fuel tanks inside the bomb bays. Rubber bladder tanks were added throughout. 10 5-gallon jerry cans occupied each aircraft, allowing crews to manually refuel during flight. This nearly doubled the total fuel capacity from 670 gallons to 1,189 gallons. The engineers approached weight reduction with equal determination. They stripped out the bottom turret entirely. Radio equipment deemed non-essential was removed. Unnecessary structural components came off. Then they installed wooden guns in the tail section, not weapons that could actually fire, but props intended to discourage fighter attacks. Lieutenant Henry Miller developed revolutionary short-field takeoff procedures that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Pilots would plant both feet hard on the brakes, deploy half flaps, angle the stabilizer back 3/4 of the way, and build maximum manifold pressure before finally releasing everything. Doolittle's lead aircraft thundered down Hornet's deck and launched into the sky in just 467 feet. Lieutenant Donald Smith accomplished something even more remarkable, taking off in a mere 287 feet. The 20-knot headwind streaming across the carrier deck, combined with the ship's own forward momentum, provided that crucial extra airspeed. The combination of speed and innovation made the impossible real. Japanese defensive planning had positioned their early warning line of converted fishing trawlers at measured intervals based on past patterns. When American carriers had previously raided Wake and Marcus Islands, they had approached within roughly 200 miles. The picket boats were stationed accordingly, spread out at set distances, reflecting that operational experience. The Nito Maru that spotted Task Force 16 sat positioned 650 miles from Japan, well beyond the perimeter Japanese strategists deemed necessary to monitor. But there was another critical factor. Japan possessed no radar systems in April 1942. The entire warning system depended on visual spotting from these small vessels scattered across the ocean. The morning of April 18th had started routinely in Tokyo. Air raid drills were nothing unusual in wartime Japan. Sirens sounded as they had many times before. Air raid wardens looked up at the sky, which remained clear and peaceful. Firefighting brigades rolled their equipment through the streets as planned, following the choreography they had rehearsed countless times. It all seemed routine, almost theatrical. When the drill concluded at noon without incident, tens of thousands of Tokyo residents resumed their normal activities. Some headed to the shops for shopping. Others strolled through parks and visited local shrines. Families settled into baseball games. The city hummed with ordinary life. A French journalist present in Tokyo that day would later capture what happened next. A deep, powerful sound cut through the air, airplane engines approaching at high speed. Then came the explosions. A dark shape raced overhead at rooftop height, moving with shocking speed. "So they've come," the journalist noted simply. Japanese civilians stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what they were witnessing. Many waved cheerfully at the fast-moving twin-engine aircraft, treating them like a novelty. Then they noticed something that made their blood run cold. White stars painted on the fuselage. American markings. American bombers above Tokyo. Realization struck different people at different moments. Some understood when bombs began falling from the sky. Others figured it out when anti-aircraft guns began thundering in response. The psychological devastation exceeded the physical destruction by an immeasurable margin. Radio Tokyo had spent months assuring citizens that they remained protected, that their nation and Emperor Hirohito were safe from enemy attack. The propaganda spoke of a spiritual fortress, a kamikaze mystique that had remained unbroken since Kublai Khan's failed invasion attempt in 1281. That protective barrier had supposedly held strong. The 26th Air Flotilla under Rear Admiral Seigo Yamagata carried primary responsibility for defending the homeland. The Kisarazu Air Group, stationed at Kisarazu Airfield in Chiba Prefecture, formed the first line of aerial defense. When the alarm sounded, they scrambled desperately. 29 medium bombers, Mitsubishi G4M Bettys armed with torpedoes, launched into the sky. 24 carrier fighters equipped with long-range tanks followed, all scrambling to locate and destroy American carriers that Japanese commanders assumed must be operating within 200 miles of Japan. Japanese fighter pilots who encountered the B-25s faced a situation that defied their training and expectations. The bombers came in at wave-top level, skimming the ocean surface before climbing only to 1,500 feet to conduct their bombing runs. Some of the very first Kai-61 liquid-cooled fighters to see actual combat engaged over Yokohama. These prototype aircraft represented cutting-edge Japanese technology. American crews, unfamiliar with the design, mistakenly identified them as German Bf-1009 fighters. Even more remarkably, the Japanese fighter pilots did not press their attacks with the usual ferocity. Some failed to drive home their assaults with maximum force. Others, confused by the unfamiliar B-25 silhouette, actually mistook the American bombers for Japanese aircraft. The complete failure of interception efforts meant that Japan's claims of shooting down 9 enemy aircraft were pure fabrication. Not a single B-25 was destroyed. Naval officer Shigeroshi Miwa noted the bitter reality in his records. The anti-aircraft batteries surrounding Tokyo fared no better. The gunners judged their altitude reasonably well, but their bursts consistently exploded just to the right or just to the left of the speeding bombers. The flak was intense and voluminous, but persistently inaccurate. Only First Lieutenant Richard Joyce's B-25 took any damage. Minor hits from anti-aircraft fire that barely scratched the aircraft. Admiral Yamamoto's reaction to the raid exposed both personal anguish and the political pressures he faced. Just days before the attack, he had written to Nihua Michi at Hageisha House in Tokyo expressing his concerns. "The thing that worries me," he confided, "is that although the war has only been underway for something over 3 months, many people are feeling relieved or even grateful to me because there hasn't been a single air raid." He then issued a prophetic warning. "The fact that the enemy hasn't come is no thanks to me," he cautioned, "but to the enemy himself." Following the raid, Yamamoto's distress became evident. "I was deeply troubled to hear that Tokyo finally experienced a raid," he admitted. Yet he added with pragmatic clarity, "I feel it was just enough of a taste of reality to shake the people of Tokyo out of their current complacency." His assessment of the military failure proved most revealing. "It's a disgrace that the skies over the imperial capital should have been violated without a single enemy plane destroyed," he declared bitterly. The raid provided Yamamoto with exactly the political ammunition he needed. He had been fighting bureaucratic resistance to his ambitious Midway plan from within the Naval General Staff. Admiral Osami Nagano, the senior figure in naval strategy, had preferred a different approach, isolating Australia by occupying Fiji, New Caledonia, and Samoa. Yamamoto's warnings about potential carrier strikes on the homeland had been dismissed as alarmist thinking. American bombers had now proven him right in the most dramatic fashion possible. The strategic debate suddenly accelerated. Military leaders who had resisted Yamamoto's plan now found themselves vulnerable to the argument that the homeland needed more aggressive protection. The deliberations moved with remarkable speed. By May 5, just over 2 weeks after the raid, Imperial General Headquarters issued Navy Order No. 18. The directive ordered the occupation of Midway and key illusion positions. Japan's objectives at Midway now crystallized directly from the desire to prevent future raids, to extend the defensive perimeter eastward, to destroy remaining American Pacific Fleet carriers, and to establish Midway as an advanced base for homeland defense. But the illusion diversionary operation, designed to prevent bomber attacks from Alaska, would require 2 carriers that could have been deployed at the main battle. This division of force would weaken Yamamoto's striking power at precisely the moment it would prove most critical. The documented reactions of Japanese military officials reveal an institution struggling to comprehend an event that shouldn't have been possible. Admiral Matome Ugaki, serving as Yamamoto's chief of staff, recorded his thoughts with unusual directness in his wartime diary. "Victory," he wrote, "today the victory belonged to the enemy." Captain Kurashima Kometo, Yamamoto's brilliant if eccentric operations officer, captured the moment in more poetic terms. "The raid passed like a shiver over Japan," he observed, a phrase that perfectly captured both the brief physical presence of the bombers and their profound psychological aftermath. Even rival officers like Mitsuo Fuchida and Shigeroshi Meiwa, despite their disappointment and bitterness, professionally acknowledged the operation as excellent strategy from the American perspective. The gap between official propaganda and actual military reality became starkly apparent. Japanese propaganda outlets immediately claimed thousands of civilian casualties. The propaganda machinery portrayed enormous destruction and massive loss of life. Yet internal military documents discovered after the war told a different story. The actual toll remained 50 killed, 252 injured, 90 buildings damaged or destroyed. The military's false claim of destroying 9 American aircraft particularly infuriated officers like Meiwa, who knew the devastating truth: they had destroyed none. Radio Tokyo's initial broadcast preceded any American announcement. Enemy bombers appeared over Tokyo for the first time in the current war, the announcement began. The invading planes failed to cause any damage on military establishments, it continued. The propaganda machine quickly shifted tactics, dubbing it the Do-Nothing Raid, attempting to minimize through wordplay what everyone had witnessed. Emperor Hirohito's involvement, although filtered through formal channels, proved significant in ways that extended beyond mere symbolism. He personally commuted death sentences for 3 of the 8 captured raiders. He participated directly in strategic decisions regarding retaliation. He issued orders commanding the army in China to totally destroy military installations, airfields, and important lines of communication in areas where raiders had landed. His involvement demonstrated how profoundly the raid had shaken the highest levels of Japanese leadership. The raid's origins traced back to Captain Francis Lowe's observation at Naval Station Norfolk on January 10, 1942. Watching Army bombers practice takeoffs over a runway painted with a carrier deck outline, Lowe suddenly realized something remarkable. Twin-engine bombers might actually launch from actual carriers. The concept intrigued Admiral Ernest King. General Hap Arnold endorsed the idea. They selected Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a test pilot and aeronautical engineer holding a Ph.D. from MIT, known as a master of calculated risk, to lead the mission. The selection process at Eglinton Field, Florida, began with the 17th Bombardment Group, which possessed the most experienced B-25 crews available. Officers requested volunteers for a dangerous secret mission. Every single man stepped forward, all 140 of them. From these volunteers, Doolittle selected 24 5-man crews. Eventually, 16 crews were chosen for the actual mission. The training regimen, running from February 27th through March 25th, 1942, pushed both personnel and equipment to their absolute limits. Pilots practiced short-field takeoffs over painted carrier deck outlines, consistently achieving launches within 400 feet. They practiced low-level flying and over-water navigation. Low-altitude bombing became routine. The modifications transformed each B-25 into a specialized long-range strike aircraft. Fuel capacity was nearly doubled. Weight was reduced through systematic removal of unnecessary equipment. Each crew consisted of 5 specialists working in close coordination. The pilot controlled the aircraft. The co-pilot assisted with all flight operations. The navigator charted the course and calculated positions. The bombardier sighted targets and released ordnance. The engineer-gunner managed the aircraft's systems and operated the defensive weapons. Among these crews were remarkable individuals. Ted Lawson would eventually author a best-selling memoir of the mission. Robert Gray would perish in the China-Burma-India theater in October 1942. Richard Cole, flying as Doolittle's co-pilot, would survive longer than any other raider, finally passing away in April 2019 at the age of 103. The launch sequence on April 18th demonstrated American naval air operations at their finest, even though heavy seas hammered the Hornet. Waves crashed repeatedly over the bow. The planned launch had to occur 10 hours ahead of schedule, forcing the bombers to take off from a position 170 nautical miles farther from Japan than originally calculated. All 16 bombers roared to life and lifted off the carrier deck between 8:20 and 9:19 that morning. Doolittle himself went first, piloting the lead aircraft with barely 467 feet of runway beneath his wings. But victory came with a devastating price. 2 complete B-25 crews would end up in Japanese custody, setting them on a path toward horrors that would lay bare the true cruelty of their captors. The 6th aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant Dean Hallmark and nicknamed the Green Hornet, ran dry of fuel and went down in the ocean near the Chinese coast. 2 men from that crew never made it out of the water. Meanwhile, the 16th plane, the Bat Out of Hell, under Lieutenant William Farrow, lost its engines over Japanese-controlled land near Nanchang and forced the crew to bail out into enemy territory. 8 men fell into Japanese hands that day. From Hallmark's crew came Hallmark himself, Robert Mader, and Chase Nielsen. From Farrow's aircraft came Farrow, Robert Height, George Barr, Harold Spatz, and Jacob DeShazer. Within days, military police transported all 8 to Tokyo for interrogation. What happened in those interrogation rooms defied human decency. The Japanese employed systematic torture methods designed to break both body and mind. The water cure topped the list. Guards forced prisoners to drink enormous quantities of water laced with kerosene and urine, sometimes as much as 5 gallons, until their bellies distended grotesquely. Then they would beat them. They would jump on their swollen stomachs. The agony was calculated and deliberate. The Japanese government hadn't left this brutality to chance. In August of 1942, they passed the Enemy Airmen's Act specifically to furnish legal justification for what they intended to do. They charged the 8 men with bombing and strafing civilians, despite having zero evidence to support these accusations. The legal framework was nothing but window dressing for predetermined murder. On August 28th, a mock trial convened at Shanghai Police Headquarters. The prisoners received no opportunity to mount any defense. All 8 were sentenced to death. But then Emperor Hirohito intervened, commuting 5 of those sentences to life imprisonment. Only 3 would face execution. October 15, 1942, arrived grey and cold. At 4:30 in the afternoon, soldiers loaded 3 men into trucks. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark was 28 years old. Lieutenant William Farrow had just turned 24. Sergeant Harold Spatz was only 21. They rode to a public cemetery outside Shanghai, where a firing squad waited. Those 3 never came home. The suffering didn't end with those executions. Lieutenant Robert Meader survived the initial horror only to die on December 1, 1943, his body destroyed by malnutrition, dysentery and beriberi after 20 months of captivity. 4 men endured 40 months locked away. Chase Nielsen, Robert Haidt, George Barr and Jacob de Chassa spent 34 of those months in solitary cells. They finally saw daylight again on August 20, 1945, when American paratroopers kicked down the prison doors and liberated them. But the Americans' punishment came nowhere close to the suffering inflicted on the Chinese people. Japanese forces sought revenge against every civilian who had helped American airmen escape. The retaliation ranks among the Pacific War's most horrific campaigns. On May 15, 1942, just 27 days after the raid, Japan launched Operation Seigo. For months, the campaign ravaged the Jiangxi and Jiangsu provinces, not ending until September 4th. The destruction covered approximately 20,000 square miles of Chinese territory, leaving entire regions ruined. General Shunroku Hata commanded the operation. Under his authority, the 13th Army under Lieutenant General Shigeru Sawada and the 11th Army under Lieutenant General Yokoyama Isamu deployed massive forces. Altogether, Japan threw 40 infantry battalions and 15 to 16 artillery battalions at the region, roughly 180,000 soldiers marching across the land. Among those forces came Unit 731 under General Ishii. 150 soldiers carried biological weapons. Cholera, typhoid, plague, dysentery, anthrax, paratyphoid, diseases meant to kill. The Japanese deliberately spread these horrors as part of their campaign of annihilation. The numbers beggar belief. Japanese soldiers executed 250,000 Chinese civilians. These weren't combatants or military targets. They were ordinary people whose only crime was offering water or shelter to exhausted American pilots. The slaughter stands as one of history's most grotesque acts of collective punishment. Chinese military forces suffered devastation too. 724 officers died. Over 23,000 soldiers were killed. Thousands more were wounded or disappeared entirely. Yet the biological warfare backfired with bitter irony. Over 10,000 Japanese troops contracted the very diseases they had unleashed. 1,700 of them died, mostly from cholera. The conquerors became victims of their own weapons. Japan launched 1,131 air raids against Chuchao airfield alone, the very destination Doolittle had aimed for. They reduced every airfield capable of handling B-25 bombers to rubble and craters. They made sure no similar raid could ever originate from Chinese bases. But the strategic impact extended far beyond China's borders. The raid set off a chain reaction that fundamentally altered the entire Pacific War's trajectory. Japan's military leaders faced a new reality. They could no longer assume their homeland sat invulnerable and safe. The immediate consequence meant recalling 4 fighter groups from across the theater back home to defend Japanese cities during 1942 and 1943. These aircraft and experienced pilots were desperately needed in the South Pacific, where American forces were advancing. Instead, they went to guard Tokyo. The misallocation of resources had already begun. This resource drain played a crucial role in the Battle of Midway. By shattering the Naval General Staff's objections and securing Army support for Yamamoto's plan, the raid opened the door to what would become Japan's first major naval defeat. The Japanese detached 2 carriers specifically to prevent any future bombing campaign from Chinese bases. Those 2 carriers weren't there when the main battle erupted on June 4th and 5th. 4 fleet carriers sank in those days. Japan lost not merely vessels, but irreplaceable veteran pilots with years of combat experience. More importantly, they lost the strategic initiative. From that moment forward, Japan would fight on the defensive, always reacting to American moves. Psychologically, the raid's impact proved equally profound. American planners recognized that they had created what they called a fear complex in Japanese minds. This psychological wound forced Japan to allocate resources inefficiently for the rest of the war. Japanese military thinking shifted from offense to defense. They expanded their defensive perimeter beyond what they could possibly sustain, stretching supply lines thin until American submarines could pick them apart at will. This defensive mentality infected Japanese military doctrine throughout the war's remaining years. The priority on homeland defense drained resources from every theater. The Solomon Islands fell, New Guinea slipped away. The Central Pacific became a killing ground. The loss of offensive momentum after Midway, accelerated by the psychological shock of that April morning, gave America the initiative. The island-hopping campaign became possible because Japan no longer possessed the resources or will to contest every position. Military historians continue debating whether Midway would have happened without the Doolittle raid. Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, in their book Shattered Sword, argue that the raid may have catalyzed events, but that Midway planning actually predated April 18th. However, they acknowledge that the raid proved crucial in overcoming resistance inside the Japanese military and pushing the timeline forward. Mark Stiller emphasizes how the raid created severe inefficiencies in force deployment that persisted throughout the remainder of the war. Among the captured flyers, one story stands out as extraordinary: the journey of Jacob de Chazer. This bombardier from Faro's crew endured 40 months as a prisoner. He experienced torture. He starved. He spent 34 months locked in solitary confinement with only his thoughts and the growing darkness of his cell. Then, in 1944, guards passed him a Bible. For 3 weeks he held that book. Words from Scripture penetrated the despair that had consumed him. Something awakened inside him, something that could only be described as grace. The Bible transformed his perspective completely. Where anger and hatred had lived, forgiveness took root. When liberation came in 1945, de Chazer made an astonishing decision. He would return to Japan. He would become a missionary. In 1948, just 3 years after his release, he arrived in Nagoya. This was one of the cities he had bombed. Instead of recriminations or bitterness, he came with a message of redemption. For 30 years, he worked in Japan, spreading his message through a pamphlet titled, "I Was a Prisoner of Japan." Millions of Japanese read it. Millions encountered his story of captivity, suffering, and forgiveness. His tract reached one man whose life hung in the balance. Mitsuo Fuchida had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now Japan lay defeated. Fuchida struggled with meaninglessness and despair. He searched for a reason to continue living. When he read de Chazer's words, something shifted. The former enemy's message of forgiveness pierced through his hopelessness. Fuchida converted to Christianity. The man who had ordered the attack and the bombardier who had been imprisoned became brothers, became missionaries together. De Chazer's fellow survivors scattered in different directions. Chase Nielsen remained in military service, eventually retiring as a career Air Force officer. Robert Hite worked in civilian life while maintaining his connection to the Air Force Reserve. He lived until 2015, the last surviving prisoner of war from the raid. George Barr bore deep psychological scars from his captivity. The trauma never fully healed. He was medically retired and struggled through the remainder of his life until his death in 1967. The Doolittle raid achieved far more than its planners had dared anticipate. Measured purely in terms of physical damage inflicted, it was modest. But measured in psychological impact, it was revolutionary. The raid shattered Japanese certainty. It accelerated disastrous strategic miscalculation at Midway. It provoked massive retaliation against an entire people. It forced Japan into inefficient resource allocation that crippled their war effort. Yet the human price cannot be overlooked. Of the 80 volunteer airmen, 3 died during the raid or while attempting to escape. 3 were executed. 1 died in captivity. 10 more perished in combat operations during the years that followed. Each one represented a family destroyed, a potential life unlived, a sacrifice that gave meaning to abstract strategy. The technical feat alone deserves recognition. Launching Army medium bombers from a Navy carrier had never been done before. The successful launch shattered a fundamental Japanese assumption about what was physically possible. This psychological violation contributed to a pattern where Japan consistently underestimated American capabilities and ingenuity. Japanese military leaders grasped the raid's significance immediately. When word reached Yamamoto, distress consumed him. Tokyo's air defense commander took his own life. Inside military headquarters, officers acknowledged failure in a way that revealed something fundamental had shifted. The myth protecting Japan, the belief in homeland invulnerability that had existed since Mongol invasions, were turned back by divine winds in 1281. That myth shattered over Tokyo in those moments. For America, the raid provided something desperately needed. After months of defeats and retreats across the Pacific, after Bataan and Corregidor and Wake Island, Americans saw proof that Japan could be struck. Bombers appeared over Tokyo. American aircraft had penetrated to the enemy's heartland. Public morale electrified. Newspapers blazed with headlines. The calculated risk-taking that Doolittle embodied would define American strategy throughout the Pacific War. The human dimension transforms dry military history into something profoundly moving. 80 volunteers who knew their odds of survival were minimal boarded those aircraft anyway. Chinese civilians risked everything to shelter fleeing Americans. Japanese civilians felt the first blast of war they had cheered 4 months earlier. Each choice carried weight, each carried consequence. Ted Lawson lost his leg in the crash. He wrote a memoir that explained what it meant to fly that mission. Jacob de Shazer returned to minister in the city he had bombed, extending forgiveness across a chasm of war and hatred. Richard Cole, the last surviving participant, lived to age 103, carrying the memories forward through decades. These stories give meaning to strategic abstractions. Military history becomes human drama when we recognize the individuals within the grand narratives. The Doolittle raid represents masterful psychological warfare. Through audacity and innovation, 16 B-25 bombers achieved what overwhelming conventional power could not accomplish. By violating Japanese assumptions about carrier aviation, exposing homeland vulnerability, and triggering strategic panic, those aircraft altered the Pacific War's trajectory more profoundly than many entire fleet engagements. The true victory lay not in the tonnage of explosives dropped. The true victory lay in minds changed, in assumptions shattered, in certainty replaced by doubt. Yamamoto's prescient warning that Japan's survival owed nothing to Japanese strength proved prophetic. The Naval General Staff's dismissal of carrier strike warnings as impossible gave way to frantic overreaction. Each subsequent strategic miscalculation traced its roots back to those moments when American bombers appeared over a city that was supposed to be unreachable. Modern military strategists study the Doolittle raid as a textbook example of asymmetric warfare, achieving disproportionate strategic impact through psychological effect. The investment seemed modest: 80 men, 16 modified bombers, 2 carriers. The return reshaped the entire war. Yet the human cost demands acknowledgement. The 250,000 Chinese civilians executed in retaliation represent one of history's most grotesque, disproportionate reprisals. The captured flyers' torture and execution violated every standard of military decency and international law. These crimes against humanity stand as permanent testimony to the brutal reality behind strategic victories. What offers some measure of redemption is transformation. Enemies became missionaries. Deshiza returned to Japan. Fuchida embraced Christianity. They demonstrated that even war's darkest extremes cannot entirely corrupt the human capacity for forgiveness and reconciliation. Their story suggests that while the Doolittle raid changed the Pacific War's military trajectory, perhaps its greatest legacy is demonstrating that humanity can recover from the worst it inflicts upon itself. Those 16 B-25 bombers that lifted off USS Hornet on that grey morning of April 18, 1942, carried far more than ordnance and fuel. They carried proof that innovation could overcome impossibility. They carried evidence that audacity could defeat certainty. They carried 80 volunteers whose courage in that brief passage over Tokyo altered the course of history. In the years that followed, their sacrifice would echo across decades, reminding us that individual human choices made in moments of crisis can reshape the world.